Here's something that will absolutely blow your mind, something the vast majority of people have never even considered. Shem, who was one of the 3 sons born to Noah, actually lived a total of 600 years and was there to see the emergence of the very first major civilizations that arose following the Great Flood. But what makes this even more astonishing, what truly stretches the imagination, is this. Based on the timeline laid out in biblical chronology, Shem was actually still living and breathing when Abraham came into the world. This means the founding father of the Jewish nation could have genuinely encountered Noah's son face to face and received direct instruction from him. In this particular video, we're going to be revealing the full chronicle of Shem's remarkable life, examining his vital role in maintaining the knowledge of the one true God, and exploring how his family line was selected as the chosen channel for God's plan of redemption for all of humanity. But before we jump into all of that, please consider taking just a moment to give this video a like and hit that subscribe button, though only if you truly appreciate the content I create here. As I always say, I would absolutely love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop a hello down in the comments section and share what time of day it is in your location. It never fails to remind us that we're genuinely part of a worldwide community. Thank you so much once again for being here with me. So, with no more delay, let's dive right into this, shall we? The righteous son, Shem in the shadow of the ark. Before the waters began to rise and the entire world underwent permanent transformation, there existed a man called Noah. Walking among his 3 sons was Shem, a name that would reverberate across generations still to come. The ancient writings inform us that Noah had reached the age of 500 years before his sons started being born. Shem entered this world when his father had lived roughly 502 or perhaps 503 years, coming into existence neither as the firstborn nor as the youngest among the brothers. The world that Shem came to know stood right at the very brink of divine judgment. Corruption had expanded throughout the land, much like a creeping shadow, and violence had filled up the hearts of humanity. Wickedness had grown so widespread and all-encompassing that the scriptures actually record how every single inclination of human thinking turned constantly in the direction of evil. The earth itself seemed to be groaning beneath the heavy burden of corruption, saturated with violence that reached into every single corner of human civilization. And yet, inside Noah's family, something distinctly different was happening. The knowledge of the Creator continued to stay alive, handed down through quiet teachings and deliberate instruction. Noah actually walked alongside God during a generation that had completely turned its back on him. This unique relationship set his entire household distinctly apart, forming an island of righteousness surrounded by an ocean of corruption. The young Shem took notice of his father's unwavering faithfulness. He watched carefully how Noah preserved his integrity even when completely surrounded by wickedness. He learned what it truly meant to remain separate from the prevailing culture of that time. The lessons that were absorbed throughout these early formative years would go on to shape Shem's very character for the duration of his lengthy life. The decision to construct the ark must have appeared absolutely extraordinary to the young Shem. His father made the announcement that waters were going to cover the entire earth, that judgment was on its way, that survival would depend upon entering an absolutely massive wooden structure. For years upon years, the family dedicated themselves to this completely unprecedented building project. Neighbors hurled mockery, strangers threw ridicule their way. But Noah continued forward with persistence, and his sons worked right there beside him. Shem developed and matured within this particular atmosphere. He was learning the ways that bring pleasure to the Most High. He was coming to understand that obedience sometimes demands acting based on faith, especially when the circumstances around you seem to suggest something completely different. When the command actually came to construct the great vessel, Shem positioned himself right alongside his father. Piece of wood after piece of wood, pitch layer after pitch layer, the ark gradually began to take its shape. The assignment extended across years, possibly even decades, requiring tremendous patience and commitment that never wavered. Timber needed to be carefully selected, properly shaped, and precisely fitted into place. Pitch required thorough preparation and careful application in order to seal every single seam against the waters that were coming. The sheer scale of this project dwarfed absolutely anything that had ever been attempted before. 3 full stories in height, with rooms nested within other rooms, designated spaces for animals of every single kind, plus storage areas for food supplies that would need to last well beyond a year. The assignment stretched out across years, and throughout all of it, Shem continued laboring faithfully. Physical exhaustion became something he grew familiar with. His hands developed thick calluses, his muscles grew stronger, his skills continued improving through relentless, constant practice. He was a witness to the mockery coming from neighbors. He heard the laughter of those people who simply could not imagine waters actually coming. Questions arrived on a daily basis. Insults were hurled regularly. And yet, the patient work pressed forward in spite of all the scorn being directed at them. Still, he stayed faithful to the work at hand, placing his trust in his Father's word and in the divine warning that had initiated this enormous undertaking. The process of gathering animals brought its own unique set of challenges. Creatures began arriving, clearly drawn by purposes that went beyond any human understanding. Every single species required proper accommodations, food sources that were appropriate, and sufficient space. Shem provided help in preparing individual compartments, getting provisions organized, and making sure absolutely everything was ready for the many long months that lay ahead. The logistics involved in caring for such a wide variety of different creatures demanded careful, detailed planning and preparation that left nothing to chance. The day finally arrived when the door was sealed completely shut. 8 souls made their way into that wooden sanctuary. Noah, along with his wife, Shem, together with his brothers, Ham and Japheth, plus their 3 wives as well. Crossing that threshold represented a point from which there could be no turning back. Behind them existed the world they had always known, deeply flawed and thoroughly corrupted, but at least it was familiar. Stretching out ahead was pure uncertainty. Their survival would depend entirely upon the structural integrity of the vessel and divine protection. Outside, the fountains located in the deep burst wide open and the windows of heaven released their torrential downpour. The earth actually convulsed as subterranean waters violently erupted. The sky opened up as rain came down, in volumes never before seen by human eyes. For a full 40 days and 40 nights, the rain fell without any pause whatsoever. The sound alone must have been completely overwhelming, creating a constant roar against those wooden walls. The ark began to lift, rising on waters that continued climbing until even the mountains themselves vanished completely beneath the surface. Inside the ark, Shem dedicated himself to caring for the creatures. Establishing routine became absolutely essential for maintaining any kind of order in the midst of total chaos. He provided food for the animals, cleaned out their living spaces, and attended to all of their needs. Certain creatures demanded special attention, very particular diets, and specific types of care. The work never actually ended, creating a cycle through tasks that would start all over again just as soon as they were completed. The days became blurred together within the dim interior, marked only by the steady rhythm of labor that was absolutely necessary. The ark continued rising on those swelling waters, lifted high above the world that was currently passing away. The silence outside must have felt incredibly eerie once the rain finally stopped. No songs from birds, no voices from humans, no sounds whatsoever from civilization. Everything outside had ceased to draw breath. Every single person who had mocked the construction of the ark now rested beneath the waters. Every friend, every member of extended family, every neighbor who had turned away from Noah's warnings, all of them gone. Mountains completely disappeared under the flood. The old world came to its end, and Shem floated high above its watery grave, carrying inside himself the memories of everything that had been lost and the weight of responsibility for everything that would come afterward. Months continued passing within those wooden walls. The waters began gradually falling. Days turned into weeks, weeks transformed into months. Time was measured by gradual changes instead of dramatic events. Eventually, the ark finally came to rest upon the mountains. The family could feel the noticeable shift when the vessel finally settled, no longer floating freely, but now firmly grounded on solid earth beneath those waters. Additional months crawled slowly by before the earth became dry enough for them to depart. Noah sent out birds in order to test what conditions were like outside. First came a raven, which flew back and forth, unable to find any place to land and rest. Then came a dove, which returned because water was still covering absolutely everything. 7 days later, another dove went out and came back carrying an olive leaf, providing proof that plants had started emerging again. 7 additional days passed, and the final dove flew away and never returned, clearly signaling that the earth was once again capable of supporting life. When Noah at last opened the door, Shem took his steps out into a world that had been washed completely clean, now empty of all human life except for the 8 individuals who descended that ramp. The landscape held very little resemblance to the world Shem had previously known. Landmarks that had been familiar had completely vanished. The geography itself had undergone transformation through the sheer violence of the flood. Mud was covering everything initially, but as it gradually dried, green shoots started making their appearance. Life was making its return, slowly yet persistently. The family stood there on a mountainside, looking out over a world that extended empty in absolutely every direction. The weight of the responsibility must have felt absolutely crushing. Just 8 people to repopulate an entire planet. To rebuild civilization starting from absolutely nothing. To establish new patterns while preserving knowledge that was crucial from the old world. This new beginning carried with it tremendous weight. From these 8 individuals, all future generations were going to spring forth. Every human being, born from that particular day, moving forward, would be able to trace their ancestry directly back to this family, standing right there on the mountainside. Shem stood there among them, having been chosen to be a witness to both the ending of one age and the beginning of another. The sheer magnitude of this particular moment simply cannot be overstated. The entire future of all humanity was dependent upon these survivors and upon the choices they would go on to make. His father was given a covenant from above, one that was marked by the appearance of the rainbow in the sky. God made the promise that never again would the waters be used to destroy all flesh. The sign made its appearance in the clouds, serving as a reminder of divine mercy and establishing a boundary on divine judgment. The seasons would keep continuing. Seed time along with harvest would not come to an end. The earth would stay stable enough to continue supporting human civilization. The family presented sacrifice. They built an altar using stones. They brought offerings to the one who had kept them safe. The smoke ascended skyward, and God's pleasure resulted in the covenant promise being given. The role that was waiting for Shem extended far beyond anything he could understand. He had been preserved not through any kind of accident, but through divine design. The selection had been purposeful, carefully planned, and part of a much larger plan that would continue unfolding across many centuries. Through his particular line, promises were going to flow. Through his descendants, entire nations would eventually rise. Though he was unable to see the complete picture, though the future stayed veiled from his sight, the foundation was actively being laid right beneath his feet. His choices, his faithfulness, his commitment to the task of passing on truth, these were the things that would shape the destiny of peoples not yet even born. The nakedness of Noah, a tale of 2 reactions. In the fresh earth, after the waters had receded completely, Noah directed his attention to the soil. Agriculture required re-establishment, crops needed planting, food sources demanded active cultivation. He went ahead and planted a vineyard, working the ground just as men had done in the world that existed before. The vines grew up, yielding their fruit through the natural cycles of the seasons. Noah pressed wine from those grapes, producing the fermented beverage that had existed prior to the flood. One particular evening, he drank from his own vintage, and the wine overcame him, its effects proving stronger perhaps than he had anticipated or remembered. Inside his tent, Noah lay there uncovered, the effects of the wine having stripped away his dignity right along with his garments. He had become vulnerable, exposed in a manner that diminished his patriarchal authority. What took place next would create ripples that would travel across generations, ultimately affecting the destinies of entire peoples. The incident brought character to light, put integrity to the test, and generated consequences that reached far beyond the immediate moment. Ham, the youngest son, walked into the tent. Perhaps he had come to check on his father. Perhaps simple chance brought him to that place. He saw the condition his father was in, his nakedness, exposed and vulnerable. The sight required a response, and the choice Ham made in that particular moment came to define his character. Instead of addressing the situation with any kind of discretion, instead of quietly covering his father and thereby preserving dignity, Ham walked outside and proceeded to tell his brothers exactly what he had just witnessed. The act of telling carried certain implications. Perhaps mockery, perhaps gossip, certainly a failure to honor his father in an appropriate manner. The words made their way to Shem and Japheth. News of their father's compromised state came to them through Ham's report. Their response differed completely and entirely from the approach Ham had taken, revealing a fundamentally different character and a very different understanding of what proper respect toward a father should look like. They picked up a garment between the two of them, placed it across both of their shoulders, and proceeded to walk backward into the tent. This deliberately awkward action served a very specific purpose. Their faces remained turned away, making absolutely certain they would not see what ought to remain hidden. They covered their father, protecting his dignity even while he was in his compromised state, choosing to honor him in spite of his temporary weakness. When Noah finally awakened from his wine-induced sleep, he somehow learned what had taken place. The knowledge reached him in some manner, whether through his own observation of how he had been covered, through his wife sharing what had occurred, or perhaps even through divine revelation. His response carried with it prophetic weight. These were not simply the words of a father who felt embarrassed, but rather pronouncements that were going to shape the futures of entire peoples. He spoke words that would come to define the futures of 3 distinct family lines, declarations that carried divine authority along with prophetic insight. First came the curse, directed not at Ham directly, but rather at Canaan, who was Ham's son. The pronouncement declared that Canaan was going to become a servant to his brothers, a statement that would echo throughout the history of nations that followed. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers. The reason behind this particular reaction has been a source of puzzlement for readers across the centuries. Why would the curse be placed on the grandson instead of on the son who had actually committed the offense? Certain traditions put forward the suggestion that Ham's action represented something more than mere observation, perhaps involving mockery or a level of disrespect that went well beyond the simple act of seeing. Others have proposed that Canaan himself took part in the offense, or that placing the curse on his line served to demonstrate the way consequences travel down through generations. The cultural context carries importance here. In the societies of the ancient Near East, honor and shame held tremendous weight and significance. Exposing another person's nakedness, particularly the nakedness of a father, represented profound disrespect. The deliberate spreading of such information only compounded the offense further. Ham's actions were a violation of the fundamental principle of honoring parents, a principle that transcended individual cultures and formed an absolute bedrock of societal stability. Then Noah proceeded to speak blessing over Shem. The words rang out clearly, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem." This particular phrasing carried unique significance, setting Shem distinctly apart in a truly remarkable way. Noah did not simply bless Shem himself by saying something like, "May Shem be blessed." Instead, he blessed the Lord as the God of Shem, thereby establishing a special relationship between the Creator and the line of Shem. This grammatical structure raised the blessing beyond mere personal prosperity to indicate divine relationship and spiritual inheritance. The blessing went on, declaring that Canaan was going to serve as a servant to Shem, inverting the birth order along with natural expectations in order to place the line of Shem in a position of authority over the line of Ham. For Japheth, Noah spoke words of expansion. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem. This suggested both geographical spread as well as a future connection between the descendants of Japheth and the blessings that would flow through the line of Shem. The peoples of Japheth would expand across vast territories, their borders extending far beyond the original settlements. Yet this expansion arrived with a curious provision attached to it. They would dwell in the tents of Shem, suggesting either a physical proximity or a spiritual participation in the blessings that had been granted to the line of Shem. Some interpreters have understood this as Gentile nations eventually arriving to worship the God of Shem, discovering shelter in the spiritual heritage Shem was going to preserve. The contrast between the actions of the brothers brought their characters to light in a moment of testing. The response from Ham revealed a lack of reverence, a failure to honor his father during a moment of weakness. The action pointed to character flaws that would go on to manifest in his descendants. A tendency toward irreverence, a weakness when it came to honoring authority, a failure to maintain boundaries that were proper. Shem and Japheth demonstrated respect, choosing deliberate action in order to preserve the dignity of their father. This difference in their approach marked them as individuals worthy of receiving blessing. Their instinct toward honor positioned them to receive divine favor. The incident taught a principle that would continue to resonate all throughout Scripture. Honor directed toward parents mattered deeply, forming a foundation for societal order as well as divine blessing. The way one treated authority during vulnerable moments revealed the true condition of the heart, exposing character that might otherwise stay hidden during easier circumstances. The choice Shem made to act with reverence positioned him to receive divine favor, while the different choice made by Ham resulted in cursing being placed on his line. These blessings that were spoken carried much more than wishes for the future or simple expressions of parental preference. They functioned as prophetic declarations, establishing trajectories for entire peoples that would continue unfolding across many centuries. Ancient cultures had an understanding that such paternal pronouncements carried real power, actively shaping destinies and determining futures. Noah, as the patriarch who had emerged from the flood, possessed authority to speak these defining words over his sons. The God of Shem would go on to become a defining phrase, repeated down through the generations. Through the line of Shem, the knowledge of the true God was going to be preserved and handed down. The covenant relationship would carry forward through his descendants, making them the keepers of divine revelation in a world that would increasingly turn its attention toward false gods and corrupt forms of worship. The blessing and the curse, Shem's divine inheritance. The words Noah spoke over Shem created far more than just a personal blessing or some kind of favorable pronouncement. They established a theological foundation that was going to shape the entire course of sacred history, setting into motion patterns that would carry on for thousands of years. When Noah made the declaration, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem," he was identifying the line of Shem as the carrier of divine relationship, the guardian of sacred knowledge, the channel through which covenant promises were going to flow. This blessing marked Shem as distinct among his brothers in ways that went far beyond mere favoritism or parental preference. While Japheth was given promises of expansion and territorial growth, and the son of Ham faced servitude and subjection, Shem gained something that was more precious than land or power: identification with the covenant God. The Creator would be known in a particular way as the God of Shem, suggesting a special closeness and an ongoing relationship between the Almighty and the descendants of Shem that would exceed what the other lines would get to experience. The structure of the blessing revealed its depth when you pay careful attention to its phrasing. Rather than saying, "God bless Shem," or "May Shem prosper," Noah blessed God as the God of Shem. This subtle difference held immense weight, shifting the focus from material benefits over to spiritual relationship. It suggested that the greatest treasure belonging to Shem would not be material wealth, territorial expansion, or political power, but rather the knowledge of and the relationship with the Most High. This spiritual inheritance was going to prove more valuable than any kind of physical possession, more enduring than any earthly kingdom. Through this pronouncement, Shem became the heir to the spiritual legacy that stretched backward through Noah, to Enoch, to Seth, to Adam himself. The line of those who called upon the name of the Lord was going to continue through Shem, making him the next link in a chain that had its beginning in the garden. He became the keeper of sacred knowledge, the guardian of truths about the Creator that might otherwise become lost as humanity scattered across the earth and went on to develop diverse cultures and belief systems. His responsibility involved preserving and transmitting understanding of who God truly was, preventing that knowledge from fading away into myth or being corrupted by human imagination. The blessing also carried forward the promise that was first given in the garden, maintaining continuity from creation through judgment all the way to restoration. When the serpent deceived the first couple, bringing sin along with death into human experience, the Creator spoke of an offspring who was going to crush the head of the serpent. This promise was going to travel through specific lineages, carefully preserved down through the generations, and the line of Shem would carry it forward into the world that existed after the flood. Every generation from Shem moving forward would preserve the hope of a coming deliverer, a figure who would reverse the curse and restore what had been broken back in the garden. The inheritance of Shem included more than just abstract promises or theological concepts. He received the role of patriarch, becoming the head of a family line that would maintain pure worship while others around them turned aside. As the world after the flood continued developing, populations grew larger and cultures began to diverge. Many would turn their attention to idols and false gods. Various nations would go about creating their own religious systems, worshipping created things instead of the Creator. Stars, rivers, carved images, forces of nature, imagined deities. But through the descendants of Shem, the knowledge of the true God would continue persisting, like a flame that's preserved in darkness, like a stream that flows through desert lands. The curse on Canaan, though it was directed at the son of Ham, served to highlight the blessing of Shem through contrast and comparison. Where Canaan would serve, Shem was going to be served. Where the line of Canaan would struggle under subjection, the line of Shem would rise to prominence and authority. The two trajectories diverged from this single moment of their grandfather's prophecy, creating parallel paths that were going to intersect all throughout subsequent history as Canaanite peoples and Semitic peoples encountered one another in conflict and occasional cooperation. This divine inheritance arrived with responsibility that matched its privilege. Shem was going to need to teach his children, who would teach their children, who would teach theirs. The chain of tradition must not be allowed to break, must not be permitted to weaken, must not become corrupted through negligence or compromise. Each generation had to receive and pass on the knowledge of the God who made covenant with Noah, ensuring that truth survived intact through changing circumstances and cultural pressures. The blessing positioned Shem as the spiritual firstborn, regardless of birth order or natural sequence. In ancient cultures, the firstborn typically received the primary inheritance and carried the family legacy forward, holding authority over the younger siblings. Though Japheth was actually the eldest brother, according to most interpretations of the text, Shem functioned as the one through whom the covenant blessings were going to flow. This spiritual primacy superseded natural birth order, demonstrating that the purposes of God transcend human conventions and expectations. Divine selection, operates by principles that go beyond mere chronology or human custom. The Table of Nations, mapping Shem's progeny. After the flood, as the earth slowly began to repopulate, the descendants of Noah spread across the land in waves of migration. The biblical record has preserved a detailed account of this expansion, mapping out the way different peoples descended from the three brothers in a document that's often called the Table of Nations. For Shem, this genealogy was going to establish the Semitic peoples who would go on to dominate much of the ancient world, creating civilizations that would endure for millennia. The text makes a record of 5 sons born to Shem: Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. Each son went on to become the father of a people group, establishing nations and cultures that would interact all throughout subsequent history in complex patterns of trade, warfare, alliance, and cultural exchange. Their territories stretched across the regions that would later be called the Fertile Crescent and the surrounding areas, positioning them at the crossroads of the ancient world, where 3 continents came together. The descendants of Elam settled in the region located east of Mesopotamia, in the mountainous terrain that would later bear their name. The Elamites would go on to build their own civilization, developing their own distinct language and culture that was separate from their relatives. They created a writing system. They established cities. They built temples. Their kingdom would rise to prominence over the course of centuries, eventually clashing with other powers in the region, including Babylon, along with Assyria. The ancient city of Susa became their capital, a center of commerce and culture that would go on to feature prominently in later biblical accounts, including what's found in the Book of Esther. The line of Ashur gave rise to the Assyrians, who were going to establish one of the most powerful and fearsome empires in the ancient world. They settled in the northern Mesopotamian region, building great cities along the Tigris River, including Nineveh, which would become famous for its size and sophistication. Ashur itself became the name of both the people and their chief city, demonstrating the importance of this particular son's legacy. The Assyrians would go on to develop advanced military technology, efficient administrative systems, and impressive architectural achievements. Their empire would eventually conquer vast territories, including the northern kingdom that descended from Jacob, demonstrating the complex interactions between different branches of the family tree of Shem. Arpachshad stood out among the sons of Shem because through him the chosen line was going to continue, carrying forward the covenant promises into future generations. While his brothers went on to found significant peoples who would build cities and empires, the descendants of Arpachshad would carry forward the spiritual inheritance that Noah had pronounced over Shem. His son Shelah, and the son of Shelah, Eber, would extend the chain that led eventually to Abraham. This narrowing focus demonstrates the way God was working through specific individuals within the broader family, selecting one line among many to carry his purposes forward. The descendants of Lud moved westward, settling in regions that would later be known by different names as populations shifted around and empires rose and fell. Various traditions identify them with peoples in Asia Minor, though the exact location and identity of the Ludites has been debated by scholars through the centuries. Ancient historians sometimes connected them with Lydia, while others have proposed different locations. Regardless of precise identification, they represented another branch, spreading from the family tree of Shem, establishing their own culture and contributing to the diversity of Semitic peoples. Aram fathered the Arameans, a people who were going to become culturally and linguistically influential throughout the ancient Near East in ways that exceeded their political power. Aramaic would eventually become the common language across vast territories, used for commerce, diplomacy, and daily life throughout the Persian Empire and beyond. Several centuries later, it would be spoken even in Jerusalem, becoming the everyday language of common people, while Hebrew remained the language of scripture and formal worship. This linguistic dominance meant that the descendants of Aram shaped communication patterns across multiple empires and countless generations. Beyond these 5 sons, the text notes that Shem had other children, both sons as well as daughters, whose names are not recorded, but whose existence contributed to the population growth of the world after the flood. The genealogy mentions grandsons as well, showing how the family branched and spread like a tree, sending out limbs in multiple directions. Aram himself had 4 sons, Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash, each establishing their own family groups that would develop distinct identities while maintaining awareness of their common origin. The record preserves specific details about the line of Eber, noting that he had 2 sons whose births carried special significance. One was named Peleg, which means division, because during his days the earth was divided. This cryptic reference has generated various interpretations across centuries of study, possibly relating to the scattering at Babel when languages were confused and peoples dispersed, or perhaps indicating the division of lands among growing populations as families claimed territories and established boundaries. Some scholars suggest it refers to a physical division of landmasses, though this interpretation remains controversial. The statement's brevity leaves room for multiple understandings while clearly marking the lifetime of Peleg as a pivotal moment in human history. The geographical spread of the descendants of Shem covered a vast area that became the heartland of ancient civilization. They inhabited lands from the mountainous regions in the east to the fertile river valleys of Mesopotamia, where agriculture flourished. From the highlands where the Arameans settled to the territories that would become Babylon and Assyria. This distribution placed Semitic peoples at the crossroads of the ancient world, controlling key trade routes that connected distant regions and facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between diverse cultures. These nations would interact with each other throughout history, sometimes in peace, often in conflict. Creating a complex tapestry of relationships. They would build cities whose ruins still exist today, develop writing systems that scholars continue studying, create laws that influence subsequent legal codes, and establish trade routes that connected distant regions. Through all these developments, they shared a common ancestor in Shem. Even as their cultures diverged dramatically, their languages evolved in different directions, and their religious practices varied from pure monotheism to elaborate polytheistic systems. The preservation of this genealogical record served multiple purposes beyond simple family history. It established the relationships between various peoples, explaining why certain groups shared similar customs, languages, or religious concepts. Trade agreements, marriage alliances, and military conflicts all occurred within the context of these family relationships, whether acknowledged or forgotten. More importantly, for the biblical narrative, it traced the line through which the promises of God were going to travel, following the thread from Shem through Arpachshad to the patriarchs who would come later, creating a clear path that readers could follow through the maze of ancient peoples and their interconnections. The line of promise, from Shem to Abram. Among all the descendants of Shem, spreading across the earth in expanding waves, one particular line carried special significance that transcended mere genealogical interest. This was the narrow path traced through specific individuals, generation by generation, from Shem down to the man who was going to become the father of a chosen nation. The line becomes increasingly focused, moving from broad family groups to specific individuals chosen to carry forward divine purposes. When Shem reached 100 years old, 2 years after the floodwaters had receded and dry land had fully emerged, he fathered Arpachshad. This timing matters because it establishes the chronology that connects the flood to subsequent events with mathematical precision. The biblical writer carefully notes these dates, allowing readers to calculate the years and understand the timeline of redemptive history. Arpachshad grew up in the New World, learning from his father about the old world that had perished beneath the waters, hearing first-hand accounts of life before the judgment, understanding why the flood came and what lessons humanity must learn from that catastrophe. At 35 years of age, Arpachshad became father to Shelah, The generations continued their pattern, each father teaching his son about the God of their ancestors, passing down stories and wisdom accumulated over lifetimes. Shelah waited until 30 before fathering Eber, from whom the term Hebrew would eventually derive. This connection between the name of Eber and the later designation Hebrew suggests his importance extended beyond his role as merely another link in the chain. His name would become attached to an entire people, indicating significance that his contemporaries recognized. Eber lived 34 years before his son Peleg arrived. During the lifetime of Peleg, the earth experienced division, whether through the confusion of languages at Babel or through some other significant separation that fractured human unity. The world was changing rapidly during this period. Populations spreading further apart, communication becoming more difficult as linguistic diversity increased. And yet, the line of promise continued, unbroken, despite these disruptions. Peleg fathered Reu at age 30. Reu waited 32 years before the birth of Serug. Serug became father to Nahor at 30, and Nahor fathered Terah at 29. With each generation, the chain stretched forward, drawing closer to a pivotal figure whose importance was going to reshape everything. The pattern of births shows gradually shortening lifespans, but continued fertility, ensuring the survival of the line even as human longevity decreased from the extraordinary ages of earlier generations. The life of Terah marked a transition point between the ancient world and the patriarchal period. He lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, a major city in Lower Mesopotamia that had become a center of advanced civilization. There, in that bustling center of culture and commerce, where trade routes converged and ideas exchanged, Terah fathered 3 sons. Though the text lists them together, they were not born simultaneously, but arrived across a span of years. Among them was Abram, who would later receive a new name, Abraham, father of multitudes. The genealogy deliberately focuses its attention more narrowly with each passing generation, creating an effect much like a funnel that concentrates attention. Where earlier sections provided descriptions of multiple sons spreading out across territories and establishing nations, this particular lineage follows a single thread with laser-sharp focus. This selectivity placed emphasis on the fact that God was working through a specific family line, chosen for particular purposes, among all the descendants of Noah, among all the sons of Shem, and all the peoples spreading out across the earth. This particular sequence carried the covenant forward, much like a relay runner passing a baton through successive generations. Abram grew up in a sophisticated city that possessed advanced culture and complex religious systems that had developed over the course of centuries. Archaeological evidence reveals Ur as a thriving urban center with impressive architecture, active commerce, and elaborate temple complexes. Traditions put forward the suggestion that his father Terah crafted idols, participating in the polytheistic worship that was prevalent during that time and in that place. The city's patron deity had an established priesthood, regular festivals, and devoted worshippers. Yet, somehow, despite existing in this environment that was saturated with false worship, the knowledge of the true God continued to persist, passed down through the generations from Shem through faithful transmission. The mathematical calculation brings to light something remarkable that demonstrates the providential timing of God. Based on the lifespans that are recorded in Scripture, Shem lived long enough to overlap with the lifetime of Abram by many years. This elderly patriarch, who had walked off the ark centuries earlier, carrying with him memories of the world before the flood, was still living when Abram was born and throughout much of his early life. This overlap meant that direct transmission of knowledge could take place without intermediaries. Abram could have heard first-hand accounts of the flood from someone who had actually experienced it. Perhaps he even sat at the feet of Shem, learning about the ancient world, the judgment, and the covenant. Consider what this connection meant for the preservation of knowledge and tradition. Shem personally knew his great-grandfather, Methuselah, who had lived long enough to overlap with the lifetime of Adam. Methuselah had been born while Adam, the first man created in the image of God, still lived and breathed and remembered the garden. Through just a few intermediary persons, barely a handful of individuals, the knowledge of creation, the garden, the fall, and the promise of a deliverer could travel from Adam to Abram with remarkable directness. The chain of tradition remained remarkably short, allowing minimal distortion or corruption of the original message. This line of promise carried more than just genealogical interest or historical curiosity. It represented the preservation of divine purpose through human generations across centuries of change and challenge. Each father bore the responsibility to teach his son, to pass on the knowledge of the covenant God, to maintain the hope of a coming deliverer who would fulfill the ancient promise given in the garden. The teaching happened in daily life, through stories told by firelight, through explanations of why they worshiped differently from their neighbors, through the transmission of names and their meanings that carried theological significance. When the call came to Abram to leave his country and his father's house, to go to a land that would be shown to him, it came to a man already prepared by generations of faithful transmission. Though surrounded by idolatry, though living in a culture devoted to false gods, though growing up in an environment that should have submerged him in polytheistic worldviews, Abram knew the true God. Because the line of Shem had faithfully preserved that knowledge like a treasured inheritance passed from father to son. The journey from Shem to Abram spanned roughly 10 generations, depending on how one counts and which textual tradition one follows, through wars and migrations, through the confusion at Babel and the scattering of peoples across continents, through the rise and fall of cities and the formation of new cultures, the line persisted with stubborn continuity. Each generation produced the next link in the chain that would lead to the formation of a people through whom all nations would receive blessing, fulfilling promises made centuries earlier to ancestors who could barely imagine the scope of the plans of God. Shem and Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. In Genesis, a mysterious figure appears briefly in the story of Abraham and then vanishes from the narrative like a comet crossing the night sky. Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of God Most High, emerges to meet Abraham after a victorious battle in which Abraham rescued his nephew Lot from captivity. He brings bread and wine in a gesture of hospitality and blessing, blesses Abraham with words invoking the Most High God, and receives tithes from him in recognition of priestly authority. The text provides no genealogy for this priest-king, no record of his parents or descendants, no explanation of where he came from or where he went. This absence of detail has prompted centuries of speculation and interpretation across Jewish, Christian, and other traditions. Jewish tradition, preserved in ancient sources including the Targums and the Talmud, dating to roughly the 2nd century and later, offers an intriguing identification that resolves many puzzles. These texts claim that Melchizedek was actually Shem himself, Noah's son, living under a different name or title. According to this interpretive tradition, not stated in Scripture itself, the righteous son of Noah survived the flood, lived for centuries afterward through the gradual decline in human lifespan, and appeared in the time of Abraham as the righteous king and priest of Salem, maintaining pure worship in a world increasingly dominated by idolatry. Several factors support this identification within rabbinic tradition, creating a circumstantial case that many find persuasive. Though it's important to note, this remains an interpretive tradition rather than explicit biblical teaching. First, the timing works mathematically with precision. The recorded lifespan of Shem, which was 600 years, meant he was still alive when Abraham met Melchizedek. The chronological possibility allows for the identification, providing the necessary temporal overlap. Though possibility does not prove identity, it removes a major obstacle that would otherwise make the identification impossible. Second, the meaning of the names align in suggestive ways. Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and Salem means peace, making him the king of righteousness, ruling over peace. These terms could be understood as titles rather than personal names, descriptions of character and role rather than identifications given at birth. Shem had certainly earned a reputation for righteousness through his actions, covering the nakedness of his father, receiving the blessing of Noah, maintaining faithfulness through the centuries. The title King of Righteousness would fit him appropriately. Third, the text calls Melchizedek a priest of God Most High, using the Hebrew El Elyon. In the period before the Mosaic Law established the Levitical priesthood with its specific requirements and procedures, the firstborn of each family typically performed priestly functions for their households. As the son of Noah and the Blessed One through whom the covenant line continued, Shem would naturally serve in a priestly capacity, offering sacrifices and maintaining proper worship. His spiritual authority would be recognized by those who understood his role in preserving knowledge from before the flood and maintaining pure worship of the Creator. Fourth, Salem has traditionally been identified with Jerusalem, or the site where Jerusalem would later stand. If Shem established himself as a king, priest in this location, it would explain why the city became so significant in later biblical history. The holiness of the city might trace back to the presence of Shem there. The tradition further suggests that Shem, under the name Melchizedek, established a place of learning. Some sources describe a house of study where the patriarchs came to learn about God and his ways. This would align with the role of Shem as preserver and transmitter of knowledge from before the flood. The action of Abraham in giving tithes to Melchizedek takes on added significance. If this identification is correct, Abraham would be honoring his ancestor, recognizing the priestly authority of Shem and his role in maintaining the worship of the true God. The encounter becomes a meeting between two key figures in the covenant line. The text in Hebrews presents Melchizedek as having neither beginning of days nor end of life, which has led to various interpretations. If Melchizedek is Shem, this description might simply mean that his genealogy was not recorded in the Genesis account of the meeting with Abraham, not that he literally had no parents or birth. The Talmud adds another layer to this tradition. It explains that the priesthood was meant to continue through the line of Melchizedek, but because he blessed Abraham before blessing God, the priesthood was transferred to the descendants of Abraham instead. This interpretation explains why the later Aaronic priesthood descended from Abraham rather than continuing through Shem. Other ancient sources support this identification. The Book of Jasher, referenced in the Bible itself, explicitly identifies Melchizedek as Shem. Early Christian writers like Jerome recorded that Jews of their time believed Melchizedek was Shem. The tradition spans centuries and crosses cultural boundaries. Some scholars suggest this identification arose to address the theological challenge Melchizedek presented. How could there be a legitimate priest of God who was not from the chosen line? If Melchizedek was Shem, the problem disappears. He was from the chosen line, the very beginning of it. Whether historically accurate or interpretive tradition, the identification of Shem with Melchizedek enriches both figures. It suggests Shem did not simply pass into obscurity after the flood, but continued actively serving God and teaching others. It positions him as a bridge figure connecting the world before the flood with the patriarchal period. The mystery remains debated across millennia of interpretation. Scripture itself does not explicitly confirm or deny the identification. This is crucial to understand. The tradition persists because it makes sense of otherwise puzzling details and fits within the biblical timeline. The longevity of Shem, his priestly role, his righteousness, and his presence during the lifetime of Abraham all support the possibility within the framework of rabbinic interpretation. Though believers should recognize this as tradition rather than explicit biblical revelation. The patriarch of the Semites, defining a people. From the name of Shem derives a term that encompasses a vast family of peoples, languages, and cultures. The Semites, or Semitic peoples, trace their ancestry back to the son of Noah. Understanding this connection helps map the ethnic and linguistic landscape of the ancient world and beyond. The term Semitic was coined by scholars in the 18th century, derived directly from the name of Shem. It describes a family of related languages that share common grammatical structures, vocabulary roots, and phonetic patterns. These languages spread across a wide geographical area, from Mesopotamia to the Arabian Peninsula to the Levant and into portions of Africa. Among the Semitic peoples, the Hebrews hold particular significance in the biblical narrative. Descended from Shem through Eber and eventually through Abraham, the Hebrews formed the nation that would be called by the name of God. They received the covenant, the law, and the promises that shaped much of sacred history. The Arabs also trace their lineage back through Shem. Traditional Arab genealogies connect them to Ishmael, the son of Abraham, and therefore back through the Semitic line. This shared ancestry between Arabs and Hebrews explains certain cultural and linguistic similarities, even as their histories diverged. The Arameans developed in the northern regions, establishing kingdoms and eventually spreading their language widely. Aramaic became so prevalent that it served as a lingua franca across vast territories. During the Persian period, it functioned as the administrative language of the empire. Centuries later, it remained the common language in Judea and surrounding regions. The Assyrians built a powerful empire in northern Mesopotamia. As descendants of Ashur, the son of Shem, they represented another major branch of the Semitic family. Their military prowess and administrative sophistication created a dominant force in the ancient world for centuries. The Babylonians, closely related to the Assyrians, developed in southern Mesopotamia. They spoke Akkadian, another Semitic language, and built impressive cities, including Babylon itself. Their culture would profoundly influence the region, particularly through their law codes and astronomical observations. The Phoenicians along the Mediterranean coast descended from the Canaanites, who, according to the biblical account, came through the line of Ham. However, they spoke a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew, demonstrating the complex interrelationships among ancient peoples. What unified these diverse peoples under the Semitic category? Primarily language. The Semitic languages share distinctive features. They build words from 3 consonant roots. They use similar grammatical structures, and they preserve common vocabulary elements across their various branches. Beyond language, certain cultural patterns appear across Semitic societies. Concepts of family honor, hospitality towards strangers, and particular social structures show up repeatedly. These shared elements suggest common origins and maintained connections, even as people spread and developed independently. The geographical distribution of Semitic peoples placed them at crucial crossroads. They inhabited the Fertile Crescent, the land bridge between Asia and Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. This positioning meant they controlled important trade routes and became conduits for the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies. In religious terms, the Semitic peoples carried both the knowledge of the true God and the tendency to turn away from him. The biblical narrative describes repeated cycles of faithfulness and apostasy among the Hebrews. Other Semitic peoples developed their own religious systems, though elements of monotheism occasionally appeared in various forms. The concept of Shem as patriarch of the Semites gives these diverse peoples a common origin point. Whether Arabic traders, Hebrew shepherds, Assyrian warriors, or Aramean merchants, all could trace their ancestry back to this single man who walked off the ark with his father Noah. This shared heritage sometimes produced unity and cooperation, but just as often led to conflict. Related peoples fought each other throughout history, disputing territories, resources, and supremacy. The family connections did not prevent bitter rivalries and long wars. Understanding the Semitic family helps make sense of biblical events. When Scripture describes interactions between different peoples, recognizing their common origin through Shem provides context. The relationships between nations become, in a sense, relationships between distant cousins. The long-lived ancestor, Shem's lifespan and its significance. The biblical text records that Shem lived a total of 600 years. He reached age 100 when he fathered Arpachshad, then continued living for 500 more years after that birth, during which time he fathered other sons and daughters. This extraordinary lifespan placed him among the longest-lived individuals recorded after the flood, though notably shorter than the 950 years of his father Noah. To grasp the significance of the longevity of Shem, consider the timeline it created. Shem boarded the ark when he was 98 years old. He witnessed the flood at an age approaching 100. He stepped out into the renewed world as a centenarian and then lived another 5 centuries. This means the life of Shem spanned the entire period from the flood to deep into the patriarchal age. He was not merely a founding figure who established a lineage and then departed. He remained present, alive, active, and able to serve as a living connection between ages. The calculations show that Shem outlived multiple generations of his descendants. He was still alive when Abraham was born. He continued living through the early years and middle life of Abraham. According to the chronological calculations, Shem survived until Abraham reached approximately 148 years, meaning he died when Isaac was around 48 years old. Some traditions, including the Book of Jasher, record that Shem lived to see Jacob born, dying when Jacob was 50 years old. Consider what this overlap meant for the transmission of knowledge. The flood was not ancient history requiring faith in old stories. It was living memory, preserved in the person of someone who had experienced it. Shem could describe the waters rising, the months aboard the ark, the raven and dove, the emerging mountaintops, the appearance of dry land. More than flood stories, Shem carried knowledge, reaching back further still. His father Noah had known Methuselah, who was born when Adam still lived. Through this remarkably short chain of personal connections, knowledge from the garden itself could reach the patriarchs. Only 3 people stood between creation and Abraham: Adam, Methuselah, and Shem. This living link served crucial purposes in a world without written scriptures. The knowledge of God, the promises given to Noah, the reasons for the flood, the lessons learned, all these passed from mouth to ear. Shem functioned as a repository of tradition, a walking library of sacred history. The gradual shortening of lifespans after the flood creates an interesting pattern. Shem lived 600 years, his son Arpachshad lived 438, and so on down the line. Each generation saw decreasing longevity until lifespans approached what we would consider normal. This decline remains unexplained in the text, attributed perhaps to changing environmental conditions or the accumulating effects of sin on human bodies. The extended life of Shem also meant he witnessed tremendous change. He saw humanity scatter from Babel, languages multiply, cities rise, civilizations develop. He observed the growth of idolatry and the drift away from the knowledge of the true God among many peoples. He watched his own descendants spread across the earth, some maintaining faithfulness, while others pursued false gods. The wisdom accumulated across 6 centuries would have been immense. Shem experienced the full cycle of human society, rebuilding itself after near total destruction. He saw patterns repeat, watched generations rise and fall, and understood human nature through centuries of observation. For Abraham, having Shem alive during his lifetime provided an invaluable resource. When God called Abraham to leave his country, Abraham already possessed understanding of the God who called him. This understanding came through the faithful transmission down the line from Shem, possibly including direct teaching from the ancient patriarch himself. The contrast between the longevity of Shem and later lifespans highlights the transition from the ancient world to the newer age. By the time of Abraham, people no longer lived for centuries. The exceptional ages of the early generations after the flood were passing away. Shem represented the last link to that earlier era. Shem, in Jewish tradition, the righteous pillar in the Midrash. Beyond the biblical text, Jewish tradition preserves rich details about the life and character of Shem. The Midrash, Talmud, and other rabbinic sources elaborate on the sparse biblical account, painting a picture of exceptional righteousness and scholarly devotion. According to these traditions, the righteousness of Shem manifested from birth. The Midrash describes him as born already circumcised, a mark of extraordinary spiritual purity. This detail, while not found in the biblical text, emphasizes the view of the tradition that Shem was set apart for holiness from the beginning. The rabbinic sources present Shem as more than a passive recipient of blessing. He actively engaged in studying and teaching divine wisdom. Together with his great-great-grandson Eber, Shem established a house of study, a precursor to the later yeshivas, where Jewish scholars would gather to study Torah. This academy, according to tradition, became a center for preserving and transmitting knowledge about God. The patriarchs themselves reportedly studied there. Jacob, fleeing from Esau, spent time learning at the academy of Shem and Eber. This tradition connects the later patriarchs directly to the ancient generation after the flood, creating continuity in the chain of tradition. The Midrash portrays Shem as a teacher of Abraham. When Abraham began seeking the true God, he found his way to the instruction of Shem. There, Abraham learned about the Creator, about the flood, about the covenant of God with Noah. This teaching prepared Abraham for the call that would come later. The role of Shem as Melchizedek, widely accepted in rabbinic tradition, adds another dimension to his portrayal. As priest-king of Salem, he maintained a center of true worship in a world increasingly turning to idols. His blessing of Abraham demonstrated his spiritual authority and his recognition of the purposes of God in the life of Abraham. The traditions explain why the priesthood transferred from Shem to the line of Abraham. When Melchizedek blessed Abraham, he said, "Blessed be Abram," before saying, "Blessed be God Most High." This reversal of priority, placing the servant before the master, was considered a failing. Therefore, God transferred the priesthood from the descendants of Melchizedek to the children of Abraham. The tradition explains he was a priest, but not his seed. Rabbinic sources emphasize the role of Shem in opposing the rebellion of Nimrod at Babel. While the biblical text does not detail the actions of Shem during that event, tradition presents him as a voice of reason opposing the construction of the tower. He recognized it as an act of rebellion against God and spoke against it. Some traditions describe Shem as founder of the sanctity of Jerusalem. By establishing himself there as a righteous king-priest, he designated the location as holy. This early consecration would later make it the appropriate place for the temple, connecting the Temple of Solomon to ancient roots, reaching back to Shem. The Midrash also addresses the character of Shem during the flood narrative. His actions in covering the nakedness of Noah demonstrated his reverence for authority and his understanding of proper honor. This incident became a teaching moment in rabbinic literature about respect for parents and the importance of protecting dignity. Traditions describe Shem as a righteous judge who settled disputes among people. As the eldest survivor of the world before the flood and bearer of the blessing of Noah, he held natural authority. People came to him for wisdom and judgment, trusting his long experience and his relationship with God. The portrayal of Shem in Jewish tradition emphasizes continuity. He links the world before the flood to the era after, the ancient patriarchs to the later nation of former slaves from Egypt, the original covenant with Noah to the specific covenant with Abraham. Through him, the chain remains unbroken. These traditions serve purposes beyond historical interest. They establish precedents for later Jewish institutions and practices. The house of study, founded by Shem and Eber, becomes the prototype for all later academies. The priesthood he exemplified connects to the later Levitical system. His righteousness sets a standard for all who follow. Shem in Islamic tradition. The prophet Sam, son of Nuh. In Islamic tradition, Shem appears as Sam, son of Nuh, which is Noah. While the Quran does not explicitly name Shem, Islamic commentary and tradition identify him as one of the faithful sons who entered the ark with Noah. The tradition presents him with respect and honor, recognizing his role in preserving humanity after the flood. The Quranic account of the flood emphasizes the division between believers and unbelievers. Noah calls his people to faith for many years, but most reject his message. When the flood comes, only the believers board the ark. The narrative includes a poignant detail. One of the sons of Noah refuses to join his father, claiming he will take refuge on a mountain. The waters overwhelm him, demonstrating that salvation came through obedience rather than human reasoning. Islamic tradition identifies Shem, as one of the believing sons who obeyed his father and survived. This obedience marked him as righteous, continuing the line of prophets and faithful people. The tradition emphasizes that the saved sons remained faithful to the message their father preached. After the flood, Islamic sources describe how Noah divided the earth among his 3 sons. Sam received the central regions, the heartland territories, including Mecca and surrounding lands. This allocation positioned his descendants in significant locations for later Islamic sacred geography. The tradition credits Sam with continuing the mission of his father of calling people to worship the one true God. As humanity spread and multiplied, the danger arose that people would forget the lessons of the flood and return to disbelief. Sam worked to prevent this drift, teaching about the power of God, his mercy toward the faithful, and his judgment on the wicked. Early Islamic historians include Sam in genealogical chains, connecting later prophets and peoples back to Noah. These genealogies trace lineages through Sam to Abraham and eventually to the Arabian peoples. The connection establishes continuity in the line of prophets and believers stretching across generations. Some Islamic sources describe Sam as exceptionally long-lived, though specific ages vary across traditions. This longevity allowed him to witness multiple generations and to serve as a living link between the generation of the flood and later peoples. His extended life enabled him to teach many generations directly. The respect shown to Sam in Islamic tradition reflects the general Islamic principle of honoring earlier prophets and righteous figures. Muslims regard the biblical prophets as predecessors in the same line of faith, all calling people to submit to the one God. Sam stands among these honored figures, a link in the chain of divine guidance. Islamic commentaries emphasize the unity of the message across generations. The same call to monotheism, the same moral principles, the same warning against corruption. These themes run from Noah through Sam to later prophets. The role of Sam was to preserve and transmit this message, ensuring it reached subsequent generations. The tradition also notes the inheritance of Sam, of spiritual knowledge from his father. Noah had received revelation and instruction directly from God. He passed this knowledge to his believing sons, with Sam receiving and preserving these teachings. This transmission ensured that divine guidance continued flowing through human generations. Some sources describe Sam as establishing communities of believers in the lands he inhabited. These communities maintained pure worship of God, resisting the polytheism and idolatry that developed elsewhere. Through these faithful communities, the true religion persisted, even as many peoples turned away. The treatment of Sam in Islamic tradition shows remarkable parallels with Jewish traditions about Shem. Both emphasize his righteousness, his role in preserving true worship, his longevity, and his function as a teacher and guide. These convergent traditions, developing in different communities, suggest a shared understanding of the importance of this figure. In Islamic historiography, the significance of Sam extends beyond his individual actions. He represents a principle that God always preserves a line of faithful believers, even through catastrophic events. The flood eliminated the corrupt generation, but through Sam and his brothers, humanity received another chance. This pattern of judgment and mercy would repeat throughout history. The theological legacy, God of Shem and the chosen line. The phrase, the God of Shem, carries theological weight far beyond its simple words. When Noah blessed the Lord as the God of Shem, he established a relationship that would define sacred history. This designation marked the beginning of a chosen line through whom divine purposes would unfold. The concept of election, God choosing specific individuals and peoples for particular purposes, finds its beginning after the flood in Shem. Among the 3 sons of Noah, all equally saved from the waters, one received the blessing that connected him specially to the Creator. This selection was not arbitrary favoritism, but purposeful design. Through the line of Shem, the knowledge of the true God would be preserved. As humanity scattered and peoples developed distinct cultures, many would create religious systems around false gods. They would worship celestial bodies, natural forces, carved images, or imagined deities. But among the descendants of Shem, the memory of the true Creator would persist. The narrowing focus becomes clear through the generations. Of the 5 sons of Shem, the promise continues through Arpachshad. Of the descendants of Arpachshad, it proceeds through Shelah, then Eber. The genealogy repeatedly selects one line among many, concentrating the covenant promise like light through a lens. This selection reached its crucial point in Abraham. God called him out, commanded him to leave his homeland, and promised to make him into a great nation. Through the descendants of Abraham, all families of the earth would find blessing. This universal promise flowed through the particular line, descending from Shem. The formation of the nation that emerged from Egypt represented the fulfillment of promises made centuries earlier. When Moses led the people out of bondage, when they received the law at Sinai, when they eventually entered the promised land, all these events trace their origin back through Abraham to Shem, to Noah, to the covenant after the flood. The prophets would later speak of a coming deliverer, one who would crush the head of the serpent as promised in the garden. This deliverer would arise from within the chosen people, from the line of David, from the tribe of Judah, from the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all of whom descended from Shem. The writers of the New Testament understood this lineage. The Gospel of Matthew opens with a genealogy tracing Jesus back through the generations. The account of Luke extends the genealogy all the way to Adam, passing through Abraham and beyond. Both genealogies acknowledge that Jesus came through the line of Shem, fulfilling the ancient promises. The letter to the Hebrews draws explicit connections to Melchizedek, describing Jesus as a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. If the tradition identifying Melchizedek with Shem is accurate, this creates a profound connection. The priesthood of Jesus would link back to Shem himself, the one blessed by Noah as bearer of the covenant relationship. The theological trajectory from Shem to Christ spans thousands of years and hundreds of generations. Yet the thread remains unbroken. Each generation received the promise and passed it forward. Fathers taught sons who taught their sons, maintaining the chain of tradition and hope. This chosen line carried responsibility alongside privilege. The people descended from Shem through Abraham bore the burden of being witnesses to the nations. They were to demonstrate what it meant to live in relationship with the true God. Their successes and failures alike would teach surrounding peoples about divine character and human nature. The scattering of peoples after Babel meant that Semitic groups spread across vast territories. Some maintained faithfulness better than others. Some preserved monotheism, while others adopted polytheistic practices. But the core promise remained, with the line that led to Abraham and through him to the formation of a covenant people. The concept of remnant appears repeatedly in this story. Even when many turned away, a faithful few preserved the knowledge and worship of God. This pattern began with the family of Noah surviving the flood and continued through the line of Shem. Later, prophets would speak of remnants preserved through judgment, echoing the original pattern. Understanding the theological legacy of Shem helps explain the selectivity of the biblical narrative. Why focus on one family line among many peoples? Because through this line, God was accomplishing his purposes for all peoples. The particular becomes the vehicle for the universal. The chosen line serves as a channel of blessing for all families of earth. The hidden foundation. Shem's enduring impact. Few stories are told directly about Shem. His name appears in genealogies, in the blessing his father spoke, in the brief account of covering the nakedness of Noah. No dramatic narratives highlight his personal achievements. No lengthy descriptions detail his character. Yet his importance to biblical history cannot be overstated. Shem functions as a necessary foundation. Without his existence, the bridge from Noah to Abraham fails. Without his faithfulness in preserving and transmitting knowledge of God, the chain breaks. Without his line, the covenant promises have no path forward. He stands as a hidden pillar, supporting the entire structure of sacred history. This hidden quality characterizes much of the work of God through history. The dramatic moments capture attention and generate stories: the flood, the Exodus, the conquest. But between these moments, faithful people quietly preserve truth, raise children, teach the next generation, and maintain the connection to God. Shem represents this quieter faithfulness. His 600 years of life encompassed tremendous historical developments. Civilizations rose and fell during his lifetime. Languages multiplied at Babel, cities grew, technologies advanced, trade routes established. Through all this change, Shem remained a constant, a living link to the world before the flood. The knowledge he carried shaped everything that followed: stories of creation, the garden, the early patriarchs, the growing corruption, the flood itself. All these accounts passed through Shem to later generations. Without his faithful transmission, how much would have been lost? How many crucial details might have vanished? His role in establishing or maintaining a center of worship and learning, whether as Melchizedek or otherwise, provided a gathering point for those seeking truth in a world increasingly fragmented by language barriers and geographical distance. Such centers served vital functions. They preserved knowledge, taught newcomers, and maintained standards of pure worship. The blessing Noah spoke over Shem proved prophetic. The Lord did indeed become known as the God of Shem. Through the descendants of Shem, the worship of the true God continued. Through his line, the covenant promises traveled forward. Through his offspring, the Messiah would eventually come. The impact of Shem extended beyond his direct descendants. The Semitic peoples he fathered influenced the ancient world profoundly. Their languages became vehicles for literature, law, commerce, and scripture. Their cultures contributed to the development of human civilization. Their ideas about monotheism, morality, and human dignity shaped entire regions. The preservation of his name in the term Semitic ensures his memory continues. Every time scholars discuss Semitic languages or peoples, they invoke Shem. Every time Arabic, Hebrew, or Aramaic is studied, the legacy of Shem appears. The linguistic family bearing his name remains one of the major language groups of the world. In theological terms, Shem represents the principle that God works through chosen instruments. The Almighty could have preserved knowledge and promises through other means, but he chose to work through human lineages, through faithful individuals passing truth to the next generation. Shem exemplifies this pattern. His story also demonstrates that significance does not require fame. The biblical writers devoted more space to some of the descendants of Shem than to Shem himself. Abraham receives extensive coverage, as do Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Yet without Shem, none of these figures would exist. The foundation supports the building without requiring equal attention. The hidden nature of the contributions of Shem reflects a broader biblical theme. The greatest servants often labor in obscurity. The most crucial work happens away from public recognition. The foundations, though essential, remain underground. Shem embodies this principle perfectly. For readers exploring his story centuries later, Shem offers a model of faithful endurance. He lived through the trauma of the flood, the challenge of rebuilding civilization, and the heartbreak of watching humanity repeat many of its earlier mistakes. Through it all, he maintained his role as carrier of truth and keeper of the covenant relationship. His life reminds us that each generation serves as a link in a chain. We receive from those before us and pass on to those who come after. The strength of the chain depends on each link, maintaining its integrity. Shem fulfilled this role admirably, ensuring that what he received from Noah reached Abraham and beyond. The ultimate measure of the importance of Shem lies in the outcome of his line. Through his descendants came prophets, kings, and eventually the promised deliverer. The blessing Noah spoke found its fulfillment across centuries and through countless generations. The God of Shem proved faithful to the line that descended from this quiet, faithful man. Though his name may not be widely known, though his story may not fill many pages, Shem stands among the most consequential figures in human history. He walked off the ark into an empty world and became father to peoples who would shape civilization. He received a blessing from his father and passed it forward to his children. He knew the God of creation personally and taught others to know him too. In the grand narrative of redemption, Shem occupies a crucial position. He connects the world before the flood to the world after. He bridges the gap between the covenant of Noah and the call of Abraham. He preserves the line through which promises flow. Without this hidden foundation, the entire structure of biblical history collapses. Therefore, the story of Shem, though told in brief segments, deserves recognition as central to understanding the purposes of God in human history. He was the righteous son who entered the ark, the faithful man who covered his father, the blessed one through whom the covenant continued, the patriarch of the Semites, the teacher of the next generation, and the hidden foundation upon which so much was built. His legacy endures in the nations he fathered, the knowledge he preserved, and the line he continued, a line that would eventually produce the Savior of the world.